Good afternoon, beautiful people. Welcome to another episode of Kiko's Free Thinkers Forum. I have in the presence of me a very special guest. His name is Carlos Garrido, and he is a co-founder of the Midwestern Marx Institute. He is currently a philosophy PhD student at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, Illinois, and he is well published. He's done a lot of journalistic work. He's been on Russia television. And we're going to talk a little bit about his background before we transition into his newest publication, which is The Purity Fetish and the Crisis of Western Marxism, which was published this year, I believe. But I just want to say, Carlos, welcome to the show, and we appreciate your acceptance of our invitation.
Thank you so much for having me on. I'm very happy to be here.
Yes, we just talked a little bit before we got on the air, and I definitely follow people on YouTube. I'm very particular about who I invite. And I was pretty stoked when you accepted the invitation so enthusiastically. That means a lot to the forum because I know we're going to have a great dialogue today, and we have an introduction of different audiences. But before we get started and we talk some about Carlos's book and his background, I wanted to give a plug into the pod and just say that it's really grown a lot since last year when we launched June of 2022. We have an outreach of 64 different countries. So we have about a third of our listenership and viewership outside the United States. And that's kind of the point. We wanted to make this an international community forum because I think that's an area, and I'm going to talk to Carlos about this. There's a blind spot, I think, in the political psyche of the United States. And I think that's geopolitics. And reading his book, The Purity Fetish, it touches on that a lot about kind of this ignorance of people in the United States, especially when it comes to affairs outside of the country. I'm sure we'll talk about that some. But I just want to say keep the listenership going, the viewership. We're not really in it for the money here. We're really here to foster ideas of communication and to not ostracize complete blocks of individuals across the country because of a lot of the propaganda that's spread when it comes to you can't talk to these people, these people. We don't see that at the forum. We see everyone that has potential. We see the potential in free thought. We see the potential in other areas. And today we're going to talk some about revolutionary potential. But I guess I want to ask you, Carlos, what is your background exactly? Like, how did you even get into this whole idea of Marxism, socialism? Like, how was your upbringing?
Yeah, well, I guess it's kind of unique because if I told you I'm a Cuban, born in Cuba, raised in Miami, you would expect me to be super anti-communist, right? But it's actually, of course, the opposite. I had the pleasure of being raised in a household of Cuban parents who left because they were against communism or the government in Cuba, but because it was the special period, things were difficult. The U.S. was strangling Cuba to the point where caloric intake dropped by half. And of course, the Soviet Union had fallen for a variety of reasons. You know, we can't get to that here, but there was, of course, internal contradictions and a lot of external pressure at play in hybrid warfare against the world's first long-lasting worker state. And a lot of people fled Cuba in that period, not necessarily because of how they felt about socialism, but because of the difficulties. And, you know, it got to a point where most of your family leaves the country and you just say, you know, whatever, let me go where my family's at. And that was kind of the reality of my parents. So I grew up in a household that, like, whenever I tried to bring some of the cultural music, the reggaeton that was anti-Cuba into the house, they were like, take that shit off. That's stupid as hell. And you know, we grew up critical of all the wars of empire, and so it was a different setting. My grandpa was someone that he was a seminarian when the Cuban Revolution took place, and he ended up leaving the church to work on the brigades that the party was doing, specifically in the rural regions of the country that didn't have access to you know, healthcare or access to education, and he was working in specifically the field of education, creating schools in the country. Um, so I grew up with stories like that of people going out into brigades and, you know, just getting massacred by the remnants of the Batista forces that were, of course, U.S. backed, and that's what people don't talk about when they talk about the imprisonment of political prisoners. They talk about it so abstractly, and what they forget is the crimes that these goons literally participated in on behest of U.S.-backed tyrannical government in Cuba that was strangling Cubans, making the vast majority of Cubans live in immiseration, while a small amount lived very richly, serving their neocolonial overlords and masters. So I grew up with those stories. Um, but I also, you're a kid, you're not super politically conscious. And there was just so many things I didn't understand. We'd go to the beach or something in South Florida, and you see these massive skyscraper buildings. A lot of the rooms are empty. You could just tell. And then you look down in the street and you see homeless people. And you're like, what is this? What's going on here? This doesn't make much sense. Why are there so many empty rooms and so many homeless people unhoused around these areas? And what particularly shocked me was when my mother had my little sister. She had developed fibromes within her, and the doctors told her, you either operate those and secure yourself a long-lasting life, or you roll with it. And you never know what can happen. If those pop, you can die. And my mom was forced to make this calculation of, do I operate and go into debt slavery, and you know God knows how that's going to end up bleeding into my family even after I'm gone. But or do I just roll with it? And she decided to roll with it. Thankfully, nothing has happened. But that was another decision at the personal level that just, it sort of broke my everydayness. It was what in philosophy you call an event, something that just breaks the quotidian character of one's life, the everydayness, and it forces you to reflect. And I never had an answer for it until Bernie Sanders' 2016 campaign came around, and started talking about the influence of private insurance companies and the commodification of the healthcare industry, and the role of profit getting in the way of doing something that is central to medicine. That, if you go back to the Hippocratic Oath, the goal of medicine should be not only to treat the sick, but to attack the conditions that produce sickness. And in many ways, like, the real goal of medicine is almost auto-abolitional. Like, this is something I've developed in some of my recent writings. Like, if medicine works well, it destroys the conditions that makes medicine itself necessary. And if you look back at the French Revolution, there was Girondist sort of utopian socialist thinkers that thought, well, if we abolish poverty, poverty is connected to illnesses. If we abolish illnesses, we won't need medicine. But it's the opposite. When medicine is commodified and its whole purpose is, its bottom line is just profit, and health is a latent effect. It seeks to proliferate itself. The more medicine you have to provide, the more profit that is to be made. So that started helping me make sense of things, that sort of overlaps with the period that I'm entering into undergrad. I had the pleasure of having my counselors and the atmosphere I was in be one where they were all socialists, democratic socialists of different sorts. One of them was a communist, very pro-China, pro-actually existing socialism. So I found myself taking most of my classes in philosophy, sociology, and political science with people that were Marxists, and most importantly, I think, that were active in organizing their community. So very early on, I got involved with the local DSA there, did a lot of organizing work, learned a lot, was obviously reading a lot of my Marx, Engels, Lenin, and other traditions of US socialism. And eventually the 2020 campaign comes around, and I, along with Eddie, who ended up founding the Midwestern Marx Institute with me later on, we kind of spearhead the campaigns, at least in the university and in the community for Bernie Sanders. And we learned a whole lot. There was a whole lot of assumptions that we had came into organizing with, specifically about Trump workers. I had this image coming out of South Florida, a more cosmopolitan site, that the rural Midwest and Trump workers were all just these racist fascists, that there's no way of establishing any connection or bringing them anywhere. They're just an enemy, bad for the deplorables. And as we knocked, literally thousands of doors and spoke with thousands of these people, we realized how wrong those assumptions were. That a lot of these people voted for Trump because not because of the ugly statements about immigrants and stuff like that, but in spite of that. Like what they liked was the idea that he was an outsider or presented himself as an outsider, presented himself as someone who was going to drain the swamp and attack the deep state and be anti-war. And at some point, he even promised something like a Medicare for all. And he didn't, he obviously didn't fulfill any of those promises, but at least the rhetoric was different from the status quo. And that's what they liked. And, as a Marxist, I was like, there's so much potential here. These are people that are already critical of the media. They're looking at the media and they're saying it's fake news. And it was so easy just to say, well, if MSNBC and CNN and all of these are fake news, just extend the analysis. Let's see what is fake news about Fox News. Let's see what's fake news about how they teach us about history, how they teach us about US history, about the history of socialist countries. So it ended up being the case of something around like 70 to 80% of the people that were in our central organizing committee were previous Trump folks, who twisted and went with Bernie, and not just Bernie, who ended up eventually becoming Marxists of the variety that we are. And it was that whole condition, some of the experiences that we felt in various parts of the left that prompted us to begin the Midwestern Marx Institute, which was started in 2020. And we had three central critiques of the left that we felt like, we had to do something in order to hopefully circumvent those central flaws. The first one was, as you hinted at, its views on geopolitics. It's been deeply anti-communist through and through. Since 1917, it's done nothing but tout from the so-called left critiques of actually existing socialism, and not even socialist countries that have been fighting against neocolonialism. Like you look back at people like Adorno and Horkheimer from the Frankfurt School, the comments that they're making about Nasser's Egypt, which wasn't a Marxist country, but was a neocolonial, anti-neocolonial government that was investing in its people, raising its people's living standards. They were calling these governments fascist. They were endorsing the war in Vietnam, and that's not all of them, but there's a general tendency. If there's something that ties all of this called Western Marxism, or U.S. Marxism, a specific trend of it, is that anti-communist stance. And we felt that that was so completely ridiculous, especially since we've been so propagandized by McCarthyism and anti-communist slanders, that to go to our working class and say, you got to fight for socialism, but everything they've told you about socialism and how evil it is and how it produces genocides and poverty and all of this shit, all of that is true. We condemn all of that, but you got to fight for socialism. you know, workers got to be pretty darn stupid to say, yeah, okay, I'll fight for this thing that has, according to you, always failed. But, now because you're the virtuous West, the virtuous, exceptional Americans, now it's going to actually succeed, even though it's failed, according to you, all over the global South. So that was one of the central things. And, as you know, I ended up formulating that as the first form of the purity fetish, because socialism doesn't, these socialist countries don't measure up to their pure idea of what socialism ought to be. They just condemn it outright. And I make the argument on the basis of my background in philosophy that they might call themselves Marxists, but there's nothing anywhere near to the Marxist worldview of dialectical materialism at play here, because they're looking at things statically. They're unable to see the role of contradictions in the movement of history. They're unable to see things from the perspective of the larger whole of totalities, and they're unable to see things in their movement. And that's the essence of dialectics, seeing things in their movement, in their interconnections from the perspective of the social totalities, and cognizant of the contradictions that are always at play necessarily in everything, in nature, human thinking, and in human societies and their development. So that was one of the first critiques. Another one that we had was, again, how they see Trump workers. And here the purity fetish applied very easily. They're too impure to organize. They're too backwards to organize. And I felt this was a tremendous mistake, as I just explained. The success that we had organizing them was kind of the pudding that showed to me, and the eating of it, that these assumptions were baseless, and they were just completely backwards from the understanding that the Marxist tradition has brought forth. Even if these people were backwards or reactionary as they're being painted, doesn't matter. Don't you still have to go to them and bring them out of those backward ideas and
Mhm.
elevate their consciousness, as the Leninist tradition would say? If you don't do that, where are they going to go? They're just going to go towards, the actual reactionaries, the reactionaries that have the backing of, the most advanced sectors of finance capital behind them, and we can't let that happen. In many ways, every successful rise of fascism has always been, as the essayist and philosopher Walter Benjamin used to say, a manifestation of a failed socialist revolution. Fascism only rises because we weren't successful in preventing that reaction from capital and in capitalizing on the crisis that's at play and mobilizing and organizing workers. So um, the purity fetish was very easy to see there. These people were too impure to organize, therefore we won't organize them. You end up with a communism that's really just preaching to the choir. You only talk to people you already agree with. And the last one that, the last central criticism that I had, this one was more specifically of the communists and left. The previous two were uh, primarily seen in the democratic socialist movement, especially that socialism conference in 2019. That besides all of the goofy stuff that comes out of it, you also get statements like Nicaragua is a totalitarian regime, and Cuba and China. It's like, why call yourself a socialist? But that's besides the point. The last point was how they look at U.S. history. They're deeply grounded in what some scholars have called the blind spot. They only see the history of struggle from the standpoint of the white worker. And when they do this, they end up with very bombastic statements such as, the US could be reduced to settler colonialism, imperialism, slavery, exploitation, and all these horrible things. And what that misses, again, in a very non-dialectical way, unable to see the contradictions at play in US history and the various periods and the various changes that have occurred, what that misses is this beautiful tradition of struggle that we have from the beginning. It misses the positive elements that were at play in 1776. It misses the fact that 1865 up to 1876, the period from the Civil War to Reconstruction, was a tremendously revolutionary period that was led by what Du Bois called the Black Proletariat, the enslaved proletariat, which won the war through a general strike. And as a war that, instead of reading it just as a civil war, we should read it as the fulfillment of the first revolution in the form of a second American Revolution, which inaugurated, as Du Bois shows in many southern states, a dictatorship of the proletariat, where the Freedmen's Bureau were basically in control and had the backing of the federal army to squash all of the reactionaries at play in. This falls thanks to a counter-revolution of property in 1876, where the old planter class and the new rising imperialist bourgeoisie in the North realizes that it no longer has overlapping interests with the Black proletariat and the poor Southern whites, and ends up siding again with the planter and undoes all of this. But we don't talk about this. Today we have countless events around the Paris Commune, which happened after these revolutions, which lasted a hell of a lot less than these, lasted just a few months. And we have these great events on the Paris Commune, and we should, but where are the events on Reconstruction? Where are the events on this dictatorships of the proletariat that were established in the US South and led by the Black proletariat? There's not many events. And so the same thing, you have after that the civil rights movement, tremendously revolutionary, working class grounded movement that undid, in many ways, at least from the standpoint of the legal institutions, a lot of the explicit fascism that was inaugurated following the counter revolution of 1876. It's a tremendously beautiful movement that radically changed the constitution of the general, not the actual document, but the constitution of the country and the social consciousness of people. We can't have the uprisings that we had in 2020 after the brutal murder of George Floyd. We couldn't have had that in 1960. I mean, they killed King, and we didn't have that, but we were able to see when they killed George Floyd that they killed one of us. That's a tremendous change in the social consciousness of the American people. And that's not to say that races don't exist and that racist institutions aren't still here. Of course they are. But the conditions that we have today for fighting together as a class, united, are better than they've ever been. And that's thanks to the civil rights revolution. And a lot of the left doesn't see this. So they look back at US history, they reduce it to the bad stuff, and then they just reject, they participate in this phenomenon that, you know, the great communist Georgy Dimitrov called national nihilism. Their national past, they reduce it to nothing. There's nothing that we can take from there. And that's horrific because socialism is in every instance the sort of general universal that has to be applied in accordance with the particular conditions and history of the people that have won the struggle for political power. This just goes back again to how dialectics looks at the questions of universals. We reject this tradition that comes from Western philosophy that says that universals is that which is the same in every moment and in all times and in all places. That's an abstract, empty universal. What makes a universal universal is its ability to reapply itself in a different form, in a different particular content. And you see socialism as a form of universal that takes different characteristics throughout history. Russian, Soviet communism looked different than Chinese communism, which they called socialism with Chinese characteristics. And it looks different than socialism in Cuba, which goes back to Jose Marti and these great traditions, than Bolivarian socialism in Venezuela and indigenous socialism in Bolivia. It always has to adapt particular characteristics. And when we look at our past and we say no, when we participate in this national nihilism that's grounded on the purity fetish, on the fact that because it's not pure, I'm going to reject it, we forego any capacity to one, connect with our people, connect with a positive history of struggle that works as a historical legs for our movement forward, and two, you know, what working class person are you going to organize if you're telling them that socialism means like death to America or these bombastic slogans that you hear people specifically online, terminally online, say. So these are deep flaws that I make the argument that are grounded in a poverty of outlook. People that are calling themselves Marxists but are not working from within the Marxist outlook of dialectical materialism. And not only does it affect their ability to understand the world correctly, like they can't grasp truth through this, but it also makes them revolutionarily futile. And it's not a coincidence that the same group of people that has spent their whole life criticizing socialism abroad have not been able to produce anything in our country. The traditions that have been the most advanced in our history of class struggles, which in my view has been the Black freedom movement, has been completely divorced from those traditions. In many ways, you look back at what like the Trotskyites were saying around the civil rights movement, they were criticizing King. they were criticizing him as a reformer, as too soft, as not going far enough. And you look back at the statistics at that time, who was getting imprisoned more than King? Who did the state fear more than King? No one. So this is it not only prevents us from understanding the world correctly, but it prevents us from changing it. And what I'm trying to do in this book, which is in many ways a collective enterprise that is the fruit of all these discussions that I've been able to have over the last few years with the folks at the Institute and the friends of the Institute. It puts forward this thesis for returning to a dialectical materialist analysis, not only to understand things better, but to give us a better opportunity at organizing our class and fighting for our conquest of political power, fighting for socialism, and for dismantling the US empire, which is the biggest hindrance in the struggle of our brothers and sisters abroad. Without the US empire, the struggles for socialism abroad would be 95% easier, because 95% of what they fight against is the hybrid warfare that the US is waging against them. So, anyways, I've rambled enough. Sorry about that, but
no, you're good. No, I enjoyed every second of listening to you talk. I just had some questions about the bio part. when you talked about um, your uniqueness as far as people's perceptions of Miami. You grew up in Miami, and the perception of Cuban and Cuban Americans in Miami, all they're going to be right wing, they're anti-communist. Like that's the common sort of, I guess, denominator that people always try to associate. How common is it people that have your story when you talk to other Cubans that left the island for different reasons? How common is that of a story?
Um, it's not super common, but it's becoming a little bit more common as younger people are looking at a futureless future in front of them, and the lies that their parents and grandparents believed about the U.S. This thing the boys called the American assumption that you can genuinely get here, work your ass off, and one day be rich. That's not a reality our generation can even project in their minds. It's not possible. It's the first generation in U.S. history to live to be expected to live worse lives than their parents. And we've had this whole phenomenon that at the Institute we call reproletarianization. In the last century, you had the rise of the middle classes. Thanks to the threat that was presented by communism and the alternative world order that presented for our workers, thanks to the struggles that we waged, which were led in the working class by the Communist Party and by other militant trade unions, some of them which were basically founded by the Communist Party, like the CIO, and thanks to other reasons as well, like the capacity to give crumbs to parts of the working class, thanks to the super profits that we extract from the super exploitation of the global South, we were able to develop a strong middle class. And it was basically the pride of the nation that we had a strong middle class. This has all gone down the wayside ever since the 70s, specifically this period where capitalism goes into crisis. The rates of profit, if you look at them statistically, they're just completely tumbling. It's almost as if someone with a big beard and long hair predicted this in his third volume of Capital. But they're dropping, and the capitalists are forced to make a decision. Well, if I can't make the rates of profit I did before, what are the routes that I can go? And there's primarily two routes. You either go abroad, take your factories abroad, your capital abroad, so that the labor that the wages that you're paying are a hell of a lot lower, and it saves in the cost of variable capital. You make more money through that, or you go to a hyper financialization, which is what we've had since the 70s, specifically in the U.S. Something like 95% of profits from the largest American companies are coming from stock buybacks, rents, and interest. And that's purely parasitical capital. That's not capital that's building factories, infrastructures. It's not building anything. It's just making money hand over fist from money itself, not from building anything. So this reality has completely transformed our class. It's destroyed the vast majority of the middle class. It's reproletarianized it is the concept that we use. And it's created a reality like the one that you have in Miami now, where a lot of these younger kids, who, some of them have a college background, maybe 4 or 5 decades ago, they would have had comfortable, stable lives. They won't have that anymore. So a lot of those assumptions that are fed to them by their parents are falling through the wayside. And, they might not be embracing communism right now, but they realize that the lies that they've been told about capitalism aren't true, that they're lies and they're baseless. And you see this in statistics like from 18 to 35, that demographic in South Florida. Who do you think they voted for in 2020 overwhelming? For Bernie Sanders.
Mm-hmm.
Who would have expected that? Would that have been something that could have happened in the 90s? Could that have happened in the early 2000s? No way. It's been the change in the objective conditions uh, that has brought about an objectively revolutionary situation, which has allowed for slowly this spontaneously revolutionary and dissenting consciousness to arise in the mass of people. The problem is that's not enough. We need people organized. We need their spontaneous dissenting consciousness not to be so spontaneous, to be able to systematize and understand what it is that is causing the evils in their life, how it is that they can move forward, and we need them organized. so that they can fight back collectively and in a planned and disciplined and organized manner, because that's what history, as far back as you can go, shows us that is required in order for revolution to succeed, for a new class to take power over the state from an old class and radically transform all of the state's institutions, the how things are produced and all of that. So that's the way that I see it, at least, and the way that I formulated in the book, is that we have everything there. Shit's fucked up. There's a crisis of legitimacy. 80 to 90% of people distrust the media. They think the media is lying to them. 80 to 90% of people don't feel like their elected representatives represent them. So
Hmm.
there's a crisis of legitimacy. The US empire, along with the neo-colonial imperialist order in general, is just crumbling. There's a new coup every month in Africa overthrowing a neo-colonial regime. So you have all of this going on. All that's missing for us to overthrow this wretched order that we live in is a way to organize these people with a collective understanding of what is wrong and how to move forward and engage in that fight. And what's preventing this, the biggest fetter preventing this development, I think, is the purity fetish. Um, so yeah.
Okay, so there's quite a bit. I'm not going to really unpack that at all, but I will mention there's a work that kind of talks about the special period and this newer generation of Cubans. It's called Capitalism, God, and the Good Cigar. I think the writer is Lydia Chavez, and I want to shout out Lydia Chavez, and I also want to tell my listeners to go back to episode 12 and 17. We had Ramon Muñiz Sarmiento come on. He talked about the special period some. He was born in 87, so he remembers some about the special period before he moved to the States. But I know everybody, it may be a different experience, but to kind of go to Carlos's point, I'm glad you mentioned that because that's a completely different perspective. A lot of people don't even know what the special period is. After the Soviet Union collapsed, that relationship between Cuba and the Soviet Union changed immensely, and that was. And some people argued, did the special period even end, at certain points because of just the dire situation when it comes to access to just basic needs, and even now there are issues with electricity. There's issues with just basic needs being met. So, and a lot of this has to do with the United States. I mean, the sanctions are insane, and you talk a lot about how the West has been able to keep the global South down with just imposing all these arbitrary rules of it's warfare is what it is, and they basically dictate other people's economies, dictate other people's lives and everything, their livelihood, because in the name of human rights, we're villainizing human beings by imposing anti-human rights abuses towards other people that we deem impure, as you mentioned. And there's just so many different things, different ways you can take that. But your book is fascinating, but it took a lot for me, and I'm not versed in Marxism per se. I'm familiar with it. I'm not going to sit here and pretend I don't know anything about it. I mean, I'd be disingenuous if I did that. But I don't know. I don't claim to be a Marxist. I don't claim to know a lot about Marx. But I have a general basis. I guess my question to you would be: it's well written, the book is, but how do you translate this message to people? I mean, we're talking about a country. I think it's 54% of the people have a sixth grade reading level in the United States. And so, how do we explain terms like dialectical materialism, the dictatorship of the proletariat? How do we explain that stuff to everyday people?
That's such a good question, and that's one that we've been tarrying with since the beginning of the Institute. And the way that we approach this project of like elevating people's consciousness is as broad as possible. That old Malcolm X saying, by any means necessary, by any means necessary. That means if we got to do 1 minute TikToks, which has been the part of the Institute that, my brother from another mother, basically, Eddie Liger
Yeah,
uh,
I see it.
has led. He's brilliant. And when we started the TikTok, when we had started the website and the YouTube, and he told me, "Hey, I'm gonna hop on TikTok to do these videos about Marxist theory and breaking things down at a very basic level and doing political analysis." I told him, "You're crazy," and thank God he didn't listen to me because at that time it was just a dancing act. There was no political commentary going on there, but he revolutionized it. This was at a time when the control over the algorithms was still in the hands of the Chinese company. Um, and we just blew up through there. And that in many ways fed all the other parts of our project. It gave us the ability to develop a really good team. We have, above something like around 60 contributors. We have a board of directors and editors that helps a lot and does quite a few different things. It helps with, book projects and reviewing articles and all that stuff, and with our Journal of American Socialist Studies. So that TikTok has part of the project has been like where we do that at a mass scale. And we, before the beginning of the special military operations in 2022, I believe, yeah, it's the years are just blending into each other, especially after COVID. But before the beginning of that, we had been able to build up nearly 500,000 followers on there, and we had videos regularly getting millions of views. And then when the war started, we were, attacking the narrative that was coming from the U.S. and NATO, and it corresponds with a time period where control over the algorithms and content moderation switches from the Chinese to the American company, and we get banned. We end up making 7 more accounts. I think I might have frozen, or you might
Yeah,
have
you're
frozen or
good.
something.
I can hear you well. Yeah, you froze some, but you're good.
Oh, okay, you're back.
Yeah, you.
Um,
Yeah, we're back in business now.
okay. So that big account got banned. We ended up making 7 more accounts, and they've gotten banned. A couple of them have gotten into the hundreds of thousands of followers, and we currently have one sitting around 50, I think 50,000 followers. It hasn't been banned yet, but it's very likely that whenever the next hot thing comes out and we criticize it, we'll get banned. So but that's been one of the parts of the project where we've been breaking down just the basic concepts as much as possible, as well as the YouTube. I've done quite a few videos. I mean, I did a video showing the overlap of the dialectical materialist method of ascending from the abstract to the concrete, using the example of Bob Ross paintings. I don't know if
Yes.
you're familiar with Bob
Hmm.
Ross. Yeah, that was my thing when I was in high school. I wasn't uh, a very attentive student, so I would put Bob Ross on during class. And I ended up having this Bob Ross video suggested to me at some point. I think toward the end of last year, and I was like, "Oh my God, this is a great example of the method." So um, I was able to jump off of that video and show the overlaps. And I think fundamentally, a lot of the things like the outlook, dialectical materialism, they're things that people already accept as common sense, but because their worldviews, so the collection of ideas that they have, are incoherent without them knowing that there's incoherence. They'll be really good with this common sense belief, but then this other one fully contradicts this one. So I always give an example of a boxing judge. We wouldn't trust the judgment of a boxing judge that gets there on the 12th round and wants to pass judgment on the whole fight on the basis of the 12th round. Well, why? Well, he wasn't able to see, first of all the rounds, so he wasn't able to see it comprehensively. He wasn't able to see the interconnection between each round, and he wasn't able to see the development of the fight, which is a central part in judging a fight. So what do you have there? We need to see things in movement to understand it. We need to see, some of the contradictions at play to understand it, how he might have won this round, but not this round. We need to see things in their interconnections to understand them. And then we need to see things in order to judge them correctly from the standpoint of the whole. That's all dialectical materialism is. You can concretize a little more after that, but that's what the foundation of the outlook is. Look at everything in its movement, in its interconnections, in its contradictions, and from the standpoint of the whole. And that's fully in contrast to the way that the bourgeois outlook, that bourgeois philosophy approaches things. It likes to separate everything from everything else. You have, of course, with Descartes, the separation of mind and body. You have with bourgeois political economy the separation of the individual and society. You get
Hmm.
your Robinson age,
Binary.
those binaries, right? Unable to see things in contradictions, right? They can't even think through contradictions. They're deeply rooted in an Aristotelian logic that says where there's contradictions, there's falsity. And that's why I start the book tracing back the sort of Greek traditions, two Greek traditions, the Eleatic with Parmenides and Zeno of Elea, and the Heraclitic, which gets then embodied in Hegel and Marxism, and the other one gets embodied in the rest of Western philosophy. And I say that this purity fetish, this absence of dialectical thinking, is in many ways rooted in these long patterns of these long worldviews and ways of approaching the question of truth that are deeply rooted in Western philosophy, which seeks to separate things from the context in which they exist in order to so-called understand them. That things about truth in ways that says no to contradictions, that is unable to think through a truth in process, how things change and truth transforms, right? The whole idea of universal, as I mentioned, is what's universal is that which exists in the same form, regardless of space and time. So that's fundamentally anti-dialectical. And what I try to do specifically in video stuff and video content that I make is get the harder ideas that are in the books and bring them to the level of common sense and show people how they already accept them. Not that these are new ideas, these are ideas that they already accept.
Mm-hmm.
And that if they think through them and reflect on them a little longer, which is all really philosophy is, reflecting on the worldviews, spontaneous worldviews and philosophies that we already have. If they do that, they'll realize that the best outlook for understanding the world is dialectical materialism, because it sees the world how it is, in exchange, contradictions, interconnections, and from the standpoint of how the whole provides meaning to the parts and how the parts provide meaning to the whole. And if you look at some of the leading studies in like psychology, right, or neuroscience, studies trying to understand how it is that thinking is even possible, the conclusion that they've drawn has been one that Engels already drew in the 1870s. And it's the same thing with evolutionary biology. Stephen Jay Gould once said that had we listened to Engels, our field would have been 100 years ahead. We wouldn't have had to waste 100 years and all these gobbledygook before realizing that Engels was right about the role that labor played in the transition from ape to man, as he called it, and developing thinking. But in the field of neuroscience, emergentism is the hot new intellectual commodity. And what does emergentism say? It says that, well, you can neither think of thinking as a sort of disconnected spiritual entity, that sort of old school idealism, no one believes in it anymore, but also the reductionism, which sort of dominates the field, is also, it doesn't make much sense. Like, what part of the brain can you point to and say, this is, when you're thinking about a cheeseburger, this is right here, it's this matter that leads to it. What has been the conclusion? Emergentism, which says that once you have this grouping of things into a whole, into its own totality, it develops qualities that you can't reduce to any of the parts nor to their amalgamation, right? So the sum of the parts, none of the qualities that are produced by the whole can be reduced to even the sum of the parts. The whole functioning as a whole develops new qualities. And this is something that Engels was already talking about in 1870. He says we can crack into the brain as much as we want. Thinking is itself a product of that interaction, and how that interaction as a whole provides the conditions for a qualitative leap into this new sort of thing called thinking, which is always thinking matter, but thinking. And Marx already saw something similar with the development of capitalism, specifically industrial capitalism, brings into being for the first time in history a division of labor within the workshop. And what happens here? He has this very good example in the first volume of Capital. He says you can get 12 people to work 12 hours. You can get one person to work 12 hours for 12 days. And you can get 12 people in one factory to work 12 hours. It is statistically proven, scientifically provable, that the 12 people working in one factory collectively for 12 hours will produce a hell of a lot more than the other two. They're working in terms of time the same amount, but there's an emergent property that comes about when they're brought into a specific totality within a workplace. So that's another thing where, like, some of the most advanced sciences are just proving things that the Marxists have been saying since the middle of the last century. And the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat is very simple. And what we have right now is under the guise of democracy, we have a rule in which the people that are in control are the people that own. State institutions, the economy, civil institutions, all of that is governed in a way that represents the interests of the people that own. And working people know this. So they call themselves a democracy, but it's in reality a democracy for the rich, for the
Hmm.
insignificant minority in society, as Lenin used to say, which means that for the vast majority of people, it's not experienced as a democracy, but as a dictatorship of capital. We turn that around and say when working people come into power, we're not going to annihilate the rich. They're obviously still going to exist as human beings. They're still going to have their connections. They're still going to have some power, and they're still going to try to overthrow any working class revolution that's successful. So for a period of time, we need this thing called the dictatorship of the proletariat, where working class people now in power use the state institutions to crush the will of the old order that wants to revert back to a time when exploitation and oppression and all these horrible things were still around because they were benefiting from it. So it's another word for that, for dictatorship of the proletariat. So dictatorship of the vast majority of people, working people, is democracy. You look at the etymology of democracy, demos, kratos, common people, not just people in general, common people and power. Common people and power. That's all the dictatorship of the proletariat is. It's genuine democracy as we've never seen it before in history.
Okay, we got. Oh, do you have about 25 minutes in
Yeah,
you?
yeah.
Okay, because I know we both got functions to go to, and I don't want to cut it short. And hopefully down the road we maybe have you back on because I'm telling you, I'm enjoying this like crazy. I just love to play back the episodes and just learn myself along with the audience. And I know this episode 54 is not going to disappoint. So again, we're talking about 25 more minutes. I want to get a clarification or at least a Carlos Garrido definition. What do you define as the West? I think that's
Mm.
a very important question just within the context of what you're describing Marxism in these terms. What is the West when we talk about Western Marxism?
That's a really good question because um, uh, uh, you have that not geological, but you have that um, I'm losing the term, but you have that sort of um, geographical term in front of the Marxism, right? And it assumes that it's just the West. So, by the way, but when I mean the West, I mean like the 14% of the global population, which controlled the rest of the world basically since 1492, and that fancies itself now as the international community. So I'm talking, of course, of Western Europe, the US. You could throw Australia in there, and as of recent, you could throw Japan in there as well. It's not technically in the West geographically, but definitely forms part of the collective West that benefits from neocolonialism and imperialism. Um, when I'm referring to Western Marxism, I'm referring specifically to a tendency within the socialist movement that in many ways could be traced back to the split in socialism that occurs at the onslaught of the First World War. So there's this big conference, Second International of Socialist parties from around the world. They decided that they weren't going to participate in the war, that they weren't going to send working class people to kill working class people for in a rich man's war. And then what ends up happening is that the leading party, the German Social Democratic Party of Germany, led by Karl Kautsky and others, it folds and it basically buys into social chauvinism and social patriotism, and it buys into the narrative of we have to defend the fatherland and this very shallow super patriotism, as Michael Parenti would say, and it buys into the war. It sends working class people to war. It votes for war credits. And since it was the leading party within the Second International, the vast majority of the parties did that too. Uh, Interestingly enough, the U.S. Socialist Party of America didn't do that. That's why you have the imprisonment of people like Eugene Debs and Big Bill Hayward and a few others under the Espionage Act, which they've brought back, of course, for Chelsea Manning, for Julian Assange, and others. Um, uh, the the Russian party, of course, didn't vote in favor of the war, and that creates what Lenin called the split in socialism. Which so-called Marxists are going to go down the route of this very shallow understanding of class struggle within their own nations that doesn't connect the struggle of colonized peoples in the global South against imperialism to the struggle of the working class at home, and which Marxists are going to actually include those struggles not as separate struggles that we have to support, but as our struggles too. And that's a tradition that develops into the Third International, sometimes called Marxism-Leninism, and that's part of one of its central foundations that, for instance, the struggle that we have here, that our working class has here against our ruling elite, is not a different struggle from the one that Gabon is waging now against its neocolonial overlords, or that Niger is waging. It's the same struggle against the same capitalist class organized globally. And that's the tradition that we're a part of. And connected to that are a whole host of different philosophical questions, like connected to that break, which is definitely political, is an understanding of Engels as someone that distorts Marxism. So there's this thing that develops called the Engels debate, um, the debate over the dialectics of nature, which is another deeply philosophical debate concerning whether the dialectics is something that applies to nature or just human societies. So you have these host of questions that arise at the philosophical level as a reflection of these political splits in a socialism that cozies up and collaborates with the imperialist, and a socialism that sees the struggle of the working classes at home as basically the same as the struggle of colonized people to overthrow the yoke of colonialism, neocolonialism, and really in general imperialism. Um, so when I refer to Western Marxism, I'm referring to that tradition, which includes a lot of thinkers, of course, from the West,
Mm-hmm.
but it includes thinkers from other parts of the world as well. And it also doesn't mean that there aren't Marxisms in the West that aren't. I mean, for me, Du Bois, an American thinker, of course, is the founder of American Marxism. He's the first person to show us that, not only do we have this abstract thing called class struggle, but what are the specific forms that it's taken in our country? Well, it's been the Black freedom movement, the struggle against racism, the struggle against various institutions, slavery, Jim Crow, et cetera, et cetera. That has been the forefront of our class struggles. These are not separate identity struggles, as like liberals like to talk about today. These are class struggles for the emancipation of Black working people. And the lot of working people in general are in throwing their efforts behind those struggles as well, and seeing them as a centerpiece of these struggles. So Du Bois is the father of American Marxism. I wouldn't consider him within the tradition of Western Marxism. The same is true of Henry Winston, one of the greatest leaders of our Communist Party. The same is true of a wide array of other people in Britain who are definitely within the West. But J.D. Bernal, one of the most brilliant scientists of the 20th century, he was a member of the Communist Party. He was showing how it was that the dialectical materialist outlook is better for the sciences and can be more fruitful for scientific investigation. People like J.B.S. Haldane and a whole host of people within the West that are a part of this other tradition. So it uses geographical denotations, but it cannot be reduced to it. Just because someone is in the West doesn't mean that they're a part of the Western Marxist tradition. And just because someone is in the global South doesn't mean that they can't be in their thinking a part of the Western Marxist tradition.
There's a central premise in your book that talks. It uses the name PMC, the professional managerial class, and spearheading this professional managerial class are three central elements: the mainstream media, the media as we know it, NGOs, and you also talk about academia, which we're
Yeah.
both a part of. I got one foot in, one foot out. Right now, I'm not sure if I'm going to go back in, but we both have ties to academia, and I think a lot of my listeners and viewers know that, even though I don't mention it a lot, I do it when it's relevant. But you talk about in the book how we need to move away from this class of people, the professional managerial left, to a worker class based left. Um, what does that look like in the United States, a worker class based left? What would that look like? I guess the end result of that.
Right. So that analysis is deeply rooted in this view of reproletarianization. And what happens is that the part of the working class that was able to elevate itself and to the old Marxist term was bourgeoisify itself in the process of becoming a middle class was the professionals and the managers, right? And different forms of white collar workers. Um, and I mean, I'm a center example of this process of reproletarianization. I'm about to finish my PhD, as we were talking about. In the 60s, that would have guaranteed me an extremely stable lifestyle. It would have guaranteed me the white picket fence, two automobiles, the ability to have two and a half kids, a dog, all this shit that's tied to the American dream.
Hmm.
Right now, what it guarantees me is poverty.
Yeah.
So the thing is that although the material conditions have changed, the social consciousness in many ways hasn't. So we have a PMC that has become central to leftist organizations, socialist organizations in the US, but their forms of relationality resemble more, again, how people relate to one another through NGOs, through the academy, through the diversity, equity, and inclusion departments, through the managerial human resource departments than it does like, working class people having beers at a bar. You get what I'm saying? So that is a way of divorcing working class people from any form of socialist movement. And this is something that's not new. Marx talked about it already with the First International, how yes, we can have intellectuals and all of these people on board. They should be on board. They play an important role. But the centerpiece of any socialist movement should be the working class. Regular workers should be the centerpiece because what's socialism if not working class people coming to power and the people that produce being the people that control the state and how they produce and all these other details. So that's
Hmm.
been one of the things that I think we have to figure out because you have, at the Institute, one of our directors, Noah Krashevik, who's the one that developed the theory of reproletarianization. He's a working class carpenter. The man wakes up at 4 o'clock in the morning to read uh, the classics and to write. Gets to work at 6 o'clock, works until like 3, and then comes home and continues to work, and then spends some time with his wife at night. It's what Gramsci would have called an organic intellectual. He's a member of the Communist Party. He's convinced all of his coworkers, which were previously libertarians, about communism. But he knows that if he brings them, they're going to be like, what the hell is this? This is not what I imagined these things being. It just feels like a HR department, and that's something that I think has to change. It doesn't mean that we're against organizing people within these sectors of society. I think that they also play an important role in doing that. I'd be self-loathing if I thought that we don't at least play some role in the struggle. I think we do, but a lot of the things that we end up wanting to emphasize in this fight are things that don't fully overlap with the immediate needs of regular working class folks. So that is, something that I think has to change, and we're not the first ones in saying this. Since this transition to a more middle class left has occurred, this has been something that leading Marxist scholars have been writing about in the U.S. from at least the late 70s.
There's a part in the book towards the end you make this juxtaposition with, I won't even call it a juxtaposition. You mentioned the subjective component and the objective component, the conditions. When we talk about this idea of socialism, um, you explain carefully how 60% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. There are already objective realities to where, I mean, a revolution is there for the taking. I mean, this everything is perfectly aligned. I guess the question I have is more the subjective part. I understand the tangibility of the objectivity, those conditions that are already there economically, especially, even socioeconomically. But I go back to where you talk about the George Floyd, the 2020. How can anyone forget that point in history? It seems like everything's going on at the same time. Um, this is a free thinkers forum, Kiko's free thinkers forum. So we don't just go automatically conspiratorial route, but I feel like a lot of these events over time aren't necessarily organic. I think that they're manufactured for different reasons by governments and everybody else. But for me, the George Floyd thing, I struggle with it when you talk about the way the sentiment was on the ground, the revolutionary sentiment, because I feel like it wasn't a revolutionary sentiment. I believe it was a reactionary sentiment based on the context of the moment. I don't think it was something that was, I never thought that there would be any sort of revolution as a result of that. Unfortunately, and I don't want to sound like a pessimist or a cynic or anything, it's just that it seemed like the same playbook over and over where there was an election happening, there was a virus all over the country at the time. There was so much going on at once, and I think people's heads were in different places. And a lot of this energy came from a certain part of the ruling class, the Democratic Party, I think. But maybe I'm just wrong. Maybe there was revolutionary potential, and it just, events happened to sort of just squash it like it always does. But I just felt like it was only because of like they hated Trump being in office. I think there were lots of factors that went into that, and not necessarily because of the brutality inflicted upon George Floyd.
I think I don't disagree with you. I definitely do agree that there was like NGOs and activist organization based NGOs that played a big role in this. When I'm referring to revolutionary potential, it's basically just the sheer fact that there was 25 million people in the streets, right? There's these activist organizations have a lot of money, but I don't know if they got 25 million people ready to come out. So what I saw in the various places in the Midwest and rural Midwest was working class people, a lot of the times white working class people who had a deep anger at what happened. And who genuinely felt, we've said this a few times, like they killed one of us. It was never that mentality like, oh, they just killed a black guy. No, they killed one of us. They killed an American working class person. And it was a pain that was inflicted on all of us. And that's what I think shows a tremendous revolutionary potential because historically what has prevented the unity of our class has been racism and various forms of bigotry. The ruling class has to divide us in order to conquer us. That's every ruling class has known that. You get that in James Madison's Federalist 10. He says the most basic fracturing of society and factions that develop are around the property question, those who own and those who don't. These are the factions we should avoid, and we avoid them by factionalizing even more the people who want to antagonize the people who own. So they want to separate us as much as possible. Racism was the centerpiece, and after the civil rights movement, the minds of a whole lot of Americans change. You're not going to get even in the most old school, backward parts of the Midwest or the South. If you go up to a white worker, yeah, they might have some stereotypical ideas about black people, but if you tell them, hey, do you want to organize with your coworker who's black against the boss? They're not going to be like, no, I don't want to do that because he's black. That's absurd. So that's what I'm talking about. There's been a change in social consciousness. And when I saw people in the street, that is a revolutionary potential in the sense that people are ready to go out to do something and they see themselves as a people more than ever. This is what at the Institute we call the American trajectory. A plurality of different peoples coming to be, while still different in some ways, coming to see themselves as a people. And I saw that at play in those protests, where again, it was as if they killed one of us. And if you look at the statistics, the police are not just killing black people, they're killing all sorts of people.
Mm-hmm.
They're killing poor people in general. They're killing white people, Hispanics, they're killing everyone. Why? Because the police is the instrument of coercion, the most dictatorial and violent instrument of the capitalist class to defend its property interests. That's what it's the as Lenin used to call them, the armed bodies of men of the state, of the capitalist state. So they attack everyone indiscriminately. They might have their own individual biases against black and brown people. That's certainly true, but they attack everyone. So I think it was revolutionary in that sense, and it had these contradictions at play where it was both, you had some of that that you were mentioning, and that ended up shifting a lot of the energies towards just electing Jim Crow Joe. And then you had this genuine potential that we could have tapped into, and we didn't because we lack part of the subjective factor is not just consciousness, it's the organizations that can structure consciousness in working class institutions. We lack those. We lack those. And so it was very easy for all of the energy to just get ciphered into the Democratic Party or just turn into, people refraining from everything or just becoming apolitical or something.
I was walking yesterday. I was thinking about our interview and just what we would be talking about. And I was thinking about this idea of revolution. We've talked about it on the forum quite a few times, in different junctures. But I was just walking around yesterday. I live outside of Nashville, Tennessee. I'm born and raised in a suburb called Franklin, Tennessee. A lot of people probably know it. Miley Cyrus, there's a lot of people, Taylor Swift, that ties to the area. And I live south of that area now, but I'm walking along the store and I just see people just operating just like nothing's going on. Gas isn't expensive. People aren't living paycheck to paycheck. It's like they're just living in a simulation almost. I don't know if they're escaping that reality. I don't know if it is because it's suburbia, but I feel like there's something underneath that. There has to be something underneath the facet, of just that illusion of stability, that illusion of the white picket fences and everything else. I was at an Ed Sheeran concert last month, 73,000 people sold out at Nissan Stadium. And I'm not even going to lie. I was there, my wife and kids went. They really wanted to go more so than myself. I really didn't want to go. And I have to say this, the worst feeling I ever had going to a concert is because my mind wasn't there for the musical spectacle. It was there. I was just thinking about what if we had people that care this much about a revolution or they care this much about their livelihood when it came to paycheck to paycheck? Why is it that we can watch sporting events all day and all night and it keeps people's attention so strongly? But when we talk about things that are so raw and dear to us, you would think that the idea of revolution in these types of times would be an easy accomplishment. But maybe it's not so easy because of all these different obstacles with mainstream media and everything else. I don't know. What are your views on that?
Yeah, man, those are tough questions. And we've had two approaches. One of them has been like with entertainment. I do definitely see that there's a way in which it's used as a distraction. That people that get home, they're tired from work. Who the hell's gonna think about revolution when you can just turn on the TV and have some fun, right? Um, One of the things we try to do, we've been incorporating it in our last few broadcasts, is a sports segment that talks about issues in various sports, and how various athletes are being exploited, and that from the dynamic of how it's happening within the sports, how it looks and how it connects to society in general. And that's a way to sort of bring people, because there's issues within all of these industries. You had Taylor Swift come out the other day and talk about how she doesn't own none of her stuff, and these stockholders and shareholders are getting filthy rich from her music. She has no control over it, right? That's a great sort of kernel that we can use and to bring people to these other areas. So that's one thing we can do. Another thing is that we have to realize for a very long time the question as to why haven't we had a revolution in the West when everything is so fucked up, has usually had various answers. One of them is racism, which I think is true. Another one is ideology. So people buy into consumerism and buy into all of these different forms of assumptions that are systematically pumped out so that people whose interests are not within the established order end up aligning them and consenting to the established order. And there's some of that. But I really like the perspective that the sociologist Vivek Shiver, we've talked to him before on the channel. He's a DSAer. There's a lot of things I disagree with him on,
Awesome.
but in this area, I think he's right, which is that we cannot undermine the role of resignation. A lot of people, it's not that they're convinced or that they're consenting, but they're resigning because they know in many cases what fighting back entails. What fighting back entails means that you can get fired, and Amazon and any of the major companies in the country, if they catch you trying to unionize, they're going to fire you. And they're going to, put you in a position that's going to be hard to get a good job afterwards. So it's very easy to just participate in resignation when those are the odds. Now there's Starbucks stores where people organize, they vote in favor of forming a union, and then the Starbucks store shuts down and reopens in another location. Gets a whole new batch of employees. So there's all these tactics, and what does getting fired mean in our society? It means going hungry, not being able to figure out how to pay rent, not being, so in many ways, it's a difficult job that we have, which is showing people why, in spite of all of those outcomes, it will still be worth it to participate in this fight. And it doesn't mean that you can't enjoy your Ed Sheeran or Taylor Swift concert or your sports. We definitely shouldn't be part of, this left that just sort of condemns everything that working people enjoy in their everyday life. We should find places of commonality and work from there. The Communist Party back in the day, they had like softball teams in Cleveland and stuff that they would, and bowling teams and all that, and different church segments of the party that would go into churches and talk to. So we got to be in civil society, be at the spots where people are going to have fun and socializing with others, and have a place there, not just look at things from a more cynical perspective, even though that perspective is important to provide nuance. It's going to be tough, but I think that the conditions are getting more difficult, and they're going to continue to intensify as the geopolitical situation develops, which is very clearly developing into a new world that's breaking through the 1492 world order of colonialism, imperialism, and neocolonialism as of the last century and a bit. Um, and since the US is the centerpiece of this world order as of the last 70 years, it's going to affect us tremendously. You're going to have people making connections in various ways, and our job is going to be in meeting people where they're at, learning from working people. That's something that is always forgotten by this PMC left. They feel like they're only educators, and every good educator knows that in order to properly teach or to properly lead, you have to learn. You have to learn and adjust yourself to where it is that your students are at. And in this case, is adjust yourself to the consciousness of the different forms that working class people are being dissatisfied by the existing order, and understand on the basis of their common sense what are the rational kernels that you can then get and re-articulate towards where you need them to go, where they should go because of their interests as working class people, their long-term interests, which is socialism. So there's various ways to do this. There's no one size fits all. You can't have a copy paste approach. If you're trying to organize in New York, the tactics you're going to use there have to look different than if you're organizing in Iowa. That's just the truth of the matter. We're not a homogenous people in the sense of we don't have internal uniformity. We have internal plurality. We're heterogeneous in terms of how we exist as a whole, and that requires different strategies, different tactics, different approaches, and being able to be creative, being able to get this outlook that we have and the place where we want to go and what we want to do in our critique, and adjust it to the individuals and groups that we're engaging with at the moment. Um, but yeah, that temptation, falling back onto entertainment and sports, and just, if I could just have uh this little rise in my dopamine that's provided by these distractions, I'm good. I don't need anything else. It's an obstacle. But we got to be smart and learn how to adjust ourselves around any and all obstacles that are thrown our way.
Carlos, I got one final question for you. And I don't know if you followed that episodes before, but we don't do a lot of this. Like, we don't do any of the rivalry shit. Like, I'm very aware of like all these different YouTube outlets and stuff. But I gotta say, from the forum to you, you have 100% respect from us. I love it that you focus a lot on the educational aspects, and you really don't get into the Twitter wars and all that shit. Um, which leads me to a question I want to ask, because the U.S. left is, I mean, you explain it really well in your book. I mean, it's a fucking joke that we call this. I mean, the U.S. left is honestly not a left at all. I mean, if you go anywhere in the world, I mean, it's a joke. I mean, we don't have universal health care. We don't have universal public education. I mean, you do until you get until you graduate high school, and then it's like, oh, you got to pay a bunch of money. Kiko's $155,000 in debt. Went to public school after secondary school. So why has he got that kind of debt on him? And I bet a lot of people are wondering. But you have people in Congress, all of them have socialized medicine. They
Yeah.
break a leg, they can't think half the time with their brain, or they fall down the flight of stairs, or they freeze on the screen, and they can get taken care of just fine. But they don't want the rest of us to have those services that they have, basic needs. But this Twitter war stuff really scares me. And so I had to be strategic who I want on the show. There's so many rivalries. Like, what's the danger of this? And what is going to happen with the US left if this continues with just all these different echo chambers within the so-called left on Twitter, especially? Like, it's so toxic. I can't even post on there. I won't post on there.
Yeah. Well, I'll just say this. It's when we started um, three some years ago, we weren't as we are now on social media. We were buying into the what we called the poke the bear strategy and just engaging in a very stupid form. And thankfully, in the process of growing and bringing in new people, we've been able to professionalize and try to be above all of that stuff. And whenever there's a controversy that comes up, if we end up commenting on it, it's always from the realm of ideas and not picking on people or attacking people, but attacking ideas and always being open to people changing. But yeah, I mean, on one side, the battle in social media for the, the struggle of ideas, the ideological struggle in social media is completely necessary in our era. People are spending 7 to 8 hours on their phone, and it has become one of the most relevant ideological fields of battles. Um, on the other side, it's so tremendously insular because of how it's set up, and it's set up obviously by the people who don't benefit from, a more healthy algorithm and a more healthy form of relationality between groups. It's so incredibly insular, and it leads so easily to this mindset that if everyone doesn't agree with my checklist politics, I'm going to condemn them forever. And that's the purity fetish. If they're not pure from the standpoint of what I think is pure, I'm going to condemn them. And it's hard, but I think that the approach that we have taken has allowed us to have in our audience people from that are on one side a part of our audience, but also parts of various different audiences, some of which are in contradictions with each other. They relate themselves quite well when they're in our audience because we try to focus on the substantive issues. We don't feed into division. And whenever we talk about a divisive issue, we always try to premise it in a way that doesn't condemn the people that are not on our side of things. Sometimes we fail, and we let our emotions get in the way. We're only human, but um, we we uh, we try to play things in a way that sees the potential for people changing and adjusting, and if we're wrong, for us changing. That's something that I think is very important. Not only do you have political immaturity, but a lot of personal immaturity in these groups that are fostered by these people that are terminally online. And how do you even go through life if you're only engaging with people who agree with you 100% on everything? It's just impossible. It's impossible to organize in that form. And the reason why, someone like Chris Smalls was successful in organizing Staten Island, which is known as Trump Island, was because he put all that bullshit aside. He said, look, we're both workers in Amazon. We both have the same struggle here. Let's fight together. And, that I'll take one Chris Smalls over 100 people online that are just bickering with each other. And so we have to fight the fight within social media, the fight of ideas within there. We should try to navigate it in a way that does not antagonize people who we think are well-meaning. There's some people who are very clearly wreckers, that all they ever do is just criticize and criticize and criticize. Those, but there's a lot of people that are just confused. They're just coming into it. They don't know how the playing field looks yet, and they're bouncing around. And those people's minds and hearts could be changed. And but we should always remember that we can have every Twitter member follow the Midwestern Marx the YouTube, Twitter, Instagram account, or whatever. We still won't have a revolution. we got to organize people in person. We got to organize our neighbors, our communities, our coworkers, our shop floors. And out of that organization, out of those discussions taking form in some form of a party or a new institution, I don't know, just because it's been a party in the past that has worked doesn't mean that today something like a network of coalitions of different groups working on the ground couldn't work. I don't know. We have to be open to whatever ends up working in our era and bringing our class to power. But so yeah, that'd be my response. Try to be. A lot of these people talk the way they do online because they're not in person. And if you try to engage online as if you were in front of someone, I find that that usually helps, because I've met these sorts of people in person, and the way that they act online is not at all how they act in
Mm.
person. They might be able to disagree with you, but they're not going to be calling you a fascist, because you don't think the US is reducible to settler colonialism or something in person, right? So, um, that's a good tip that I always try to approach things through. And we also have our idols, our people who we seek to emulate. For us, someone like Henry Winston is, the top of the line. For me as a Cuban, people like Fidel and Che as well. So whenever these sorts of discussions come up, I always try to think like, how would these idols of mine approach these issues? Would they be, cracking jokes and making disrespectful statements and condemning people in ways that are not very professional or mature? Or would they try to take the high road and figure out maybe if the person I'm talking to won't accept the ideas, the people following them might have their minds changed depending on how I approach things. So that's been the way that we've tried to approach. But again, we had to develop into that. It wasn't how we came into being, and I, in many ways, can't blame people who are there because we were there. And if we can play a role in not just changing their minds, but changing how they interact with other people as well, I think that's something that we always try to keep in mind and try to emphasize when we're on streams or whatever.
Well, Carlos, soon to be Dr. Carlos Garrido. Let's try to do a part two in December if you all agree with that, because this has been a wonderful episode 54. And I knew it was going to be a great dynamic episode. There's so many more questions I have about Marxism. We've had Jay Carrico on 3 times, and Jay's a little bit more versed in the terminology, and Jay's done a good job explaining things as alongside yourself. But that's the purpose. Like a lot of the people that I'm introducing this stuff to, they may not have listened to any sort of a political podcast before. But the whole point is to sort of get people to bring their walls down, even with politics. Any sort of issue that you come from a certain like upbringing that's like more uptight, and you can't talk about these issues, these subjects. The whole point of the forum is to introduce this, especially to people who may not have that exposure or comfort level in the first place, to talk about race or sexuality or politics, anything that has been deemed okay, this is an obstacle, you don't talk about it, you do everything else. We bleed red when you do everything else. Like we don't talk about those things. No, we do the opposite here. We're all about bringing different types of people on. Tomorrow we have someone on that's running for president of the United States as a libertarian, completely about the free market. But we even not engage those ideas, and there's some commonality even with people that we disagree with on a lot of things. And it's all about engaging people. We can't just write people off. And so I appreciate again from me to you just your educational forum known as the Midwestern Marx Institute, and just a lot of the great literature that you all have produced over your recent history. And so I wish you continued success with that. You and your coworkers there, Eddie and everyone else, the rest of the crew, Noah. And I just wanted to ask you, are there any final words you have for my audience before you leave today?
Well, it's been a pleasure, an incredibly enjoyable conversation, and I'd be happy to come back on whenever. Um, I think the approach that you're taking is phenomenal, cracking into new audiences. It's so important, and it's one of the biggest flaws in the left. They just love talking to themselves and end up a little
Yeah.
social club more than a way of engaging in politics, which requires engaging with people we disagree with. Yeah, I'd say, check out our work on social media. We're at Marx Midwest on Twitter, and then Midwestern Marx everywhere else, Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, um, TikTok as well. And Yeah, check out our publishing press. We're putting out books. We're trying to put them out on a bi-monthly basis. We have a bunch of manuscripts that we're working with, but the last one that we came out with was from one of our editorial counselors, The Outcome of Classical German Philosophy, which is a really lucid commentary on one of the most important philosophical texts that Frederick Engels ever writes concerning the inspirations, the philosophical inspirations behind Marxism, tracing them back to how they take some parts of G.W. of Hegel and some parts of Ludwig Feuerbach and leave some other parts behind and take it forward into a radically new world outlook. So yeah, check out our publishing press, our website. We're constantly putting articles up. Our YouTube, we have anywhere from 4 to 5 broadcasts weekly, interviews, all sorts of stuff, and um, yeah, that's all. And now we're doing classes as well. We have a Marxism school that we've been running. We've ran 3 classes. I am teaching one that's about to end on Marxism and the history of Western philosophy. Noah just taught one on the basics of Marxism, which is the only one that we've done live stream as well. You can go back and watch those. And Professor Danny Shaw, who teaches at City University, New York, he's doing one on reformer revolutions and on the Marxist view of revolutions past. He's covering, the Haitian Revolution in 1804, the Paris Commune, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese, the Cuban, the Nicaraguan Revolution. So it's an incredibly broad, but yet very, very well detailed class. And so yeah, look out for that. We'll probably have a new class up for signups pretty soon. They usually last 8 to 10 weeks, and they're as professional and university style as you can get, but within the context of an outlook that represents working people and not, the ruling elite. But yeah, that'll be all. Thank you.
I know my audience will appreciate that because I know some audience members have taken courses with you all at the Midwestern Marx Institute. So I just want to say again, thanks to you, Carlos, and we're going to link all your information in our description, the episode description. This has been a wonderful episode 54, and we can't wait to have you back on in December, possibly.
Likewise, brother. Thank you so much again for having me on.
Beautiful people, enjoy your day. We have 20 to 25 guests lined up between now and the end of October. So look forward to more dynamic conversations, international community, domestic community. Have a great day, and we'll talk soon. Cheers to everyone.